All right, everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Liberty Lens. And it's going to be a great episode because we're talking about everybody's favorite thing: elections, votes, actual results for all the nonsense that we spout in between those elections. So, to help me in this noble task, I have none other than my friend and co host, Mr. Mike Termott. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Post-election hangover.
Post election hangover or post election high, Mike. I'm not sure which one it is, but
Probably
let's
neither.
probably neither. Okay, we are overhyping on both ends of the spectrum, I guess. Okay, but let's get right to it. Today is Wednesday, November 5th, which means yesterday was elections in a lot of parts of the country. And while these weren't necessarily all national elections, they do offer some sort of context into the current state of American politics, and certainly could be interpreted as perhaps a small leading indicator on how Americans are feeling the president is doing. I'm trying to pick my words very carefully, Mike. I don't want to overhype it too much, but let me just give some quick let's call them spotlight elections and issues that
Yep.
were decided yesterday.
Background
Eh,
data.
Background data, and then we could go and talk about each one of them. There were basically two governorships up for election: one in Virginia, one in New Jersey, both won by Democrats. We had a spotlight, sort of ideological election taking place by proxy in New York City, my backyard over here, where Zoran Mamdani became the first Muslim mayor in the city's history, and we could talk about that. And
Which is not nearly as interesting as he's the first openly, avowedly socialist, but
yes, possibly we could debate De Blasio whether he was a socialist or a communist or whatever,
he
but we could.
was. He just didn't say so as blatantly. I'm less interested in the fact that Zoran is a Muslim. That's the least of our problems.
Right, right, but we're going by firsts, right? So, and in California, Proposition 50 was approved by the voters, which enables a new congressional map to be drawn uh,
Yep.
at Newsom's behest, which probably will end up netting five additional Democratic seats in Congress for California and the
Five
Democrats.
being a big number.
Yes, it could have. It has repercussions, and we could talk about that. Okay, so let's start off with the one that everyone's buzzing about. Let's talk about the New York City mayor's race. Now, there's been a lot said about this, and even by New York City standards, of which I've been a participant for almost the entirety of my 60 years on this earth, Mike.
I'm I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, this one was weird even by New York City standards. And
That's
first of
fair.
all, it was a three-way race. You had and
Was it?
well, there were three major participants. It was Zoran Mamdani, a 34-year-old avowed, open, democratic socialist. You also had the Republican nominee was someone named Curtis Sliwa. If you don't recognize that name, it's because nobody does. He was essentially the founder of the Guardian Angels, a vigilante group formed in the late 70s in New York City to protect people from subway violence.
Yep.
And he's been a hanger on ever since then. And then you had former Democratic New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo running
Yep.
as an independent, which is that's even a generous way of describing it. He was actually the candidate of the Fight and Deliver Party. And if you're shaking your head at what a Fight and Deliver Party is, I have no idea either. But it was the only way he could worm his way onto the ballot, and we could talk about ballot access as part of this discussion
Yes.
as
I
well.
think this is the high water mark for the fight and deliver party.
Right. Mamdani is projected to have won the race with about 50.5% of the
Yep.
vote. The vote, a record turnout. I think they said it's been the highest voter turnout in 60 years almost. 2 million New York City residents, not New York State residents, New York
Yeah.
City residents.
Almost
Uh,
as many as turned out in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia.
right. Came out to vote. So I'll give you the floor, Mr. Termott. What do we make of this election? Start with the general and work deductively down.
Starting with the general and working back chronologically, the general, I think, showed Cuomo's heart wasn't all that into it. I don't think his supporters were all that into it. I don't think he's
No.
a great mayoral candidate. I don't think he's a great candidate for much of anything these days. It, his campaign, it was what was around which a lot of folks rallied trying to stop
Right.
Mamdani, because that was really the only game in town. Nobody was going to rally around Sliwa. I think Sliwa's background is a mismatch for the Republican Party. I don't think you had a great number of Republicans interested in that campaign, much less non-Republican New Yorkers, right? So Trump endorsed Cuomo in a last ditch effort. Presumably, the White House thought this was a good idea. A lot of folks thought it was a bad idea. I don't really know how that cuts net, because, as you know, a Trump endorsement of a Democrat is a bit of a weird look. And some people argued it mobilized even more folks for Mamdani. The general, I don't think, showed us all that much that we didn't already know. One of the things that I found really interesting about the general were the exit poll
Yes.
results. You just mentioned a moment ago, highlighted were New Yorkers' concerns about affordability, about the economy more generally. And for my money, that was the big lesson, right? The big lesson was that whether you're running for mayor in New York or you're running for governor in New Jersey or is the economy.
Yeah. Going back to that old Clinton adage, it's the economy, stupid. So let me also throw something else in which we didn't mention. Yes, it was a three-way race, but the opposition was bungled. This was one of the weirdest elections in the sense that I don't think any organized party did a good job. You had the Democrats who did not want Mamdani. He won the primary when
And
he was
couldn't stop him, couldn't figure out how to stop him.
right. He won the primary when he was polling at 6%, and he won the primary. Part of it
In a
was
matter of months, went from 6% to winning.
right. Part of it was, as you said, the easily visible aloofness that with which Cuomo ran. You had the sitting mayor, Eric Adams, who was sort of running, but not really running, thought he was running, sucked up to Trump in order to run. And
Well, sucked up to Trump instead of going to jail.
right, right. I'm not saying he shouldn't have sucked up to Trump, but we're talking about perception, right? The sitting mayor, who you would have thought should have been the shoe-in for his party's nomination, Eric Adams, former cop, Democrat, and he did not have any sort of real support rolling in. But because of the way the election laws are, his name was still on the ballot. So we said it was a three-way race. Adams, for whatever supporters he still had within the Democratic Party, was also on the ballot. He couldn't get his name removed because of election law. And this was one of those cases, Mike, and you could talk to it being a libertarian who always had to fight for ballot access. And let's face it, Mike's name, the last presidential election cycle, Mike's name and Chase Oliver's names were not on New York ballots because the Libertarian Party has no ballot access in New York. And Mike, maybe you can explain to me how the Fight and Deliver Party and the Protect All Animals Party could find their way onto New York City ballots, but the Libertarians could not. The Greens could not. And this is baffling to me. And
You,
I don't
you
know
can
if
get on in New York City. You can't get on in New York State. That's the short answer. And I won't presume to be an expert on New York State
yeah.
ballot access laws, but to get on for the entirety of New York State is really a giant lift. This is partly because the Democrats reacted badly to Larry Sharpe having done pretty well several years ago. And a lot of folks decide that's enough of that, right? We can't have the likes of
Right,
Larry challenging
right.
our establishment politicians. So they set the bar, instead of very, very high, they set it ridiculously high, and something like, I don't remember what the rule is. It's something like 6 weeks to get 60,000 signatures or something. It's really very, very difficult to achieve. And as you may know, the cost, the price of getting signatures these days is double what it was just a few years ago. It's an
Right.
extremely expensive process and requires going through all kinds of hoops to get it ratified and verified. So it can be done in New York City, whereas it cannot be done in New York State so easily. So yeah, we have this weird circumstance. You're right. Adams was the candidate of choice, right?
Right.
He should be mayor of New York. Now, whether he committed the crimes of which he has been accused, I don't I don't know. Let me,
Yeah.
be very clear about I don't know. Nor do I have a dog in that. I'm not trying to be obtuse. I really don't know. And maybe it's because I haven't cared enough to do enough analysis. But the Trump administration got involved and, extending the idea of this pardon and getting him out of the race just made it uh, too silly by half, as they say. And in my view, really set the stage for Mamdani coming out of nowhere. If folks had known that Adams wasn't going to be in it, I think we would have seen some other better candidates than Mamdani or Cuomo.
Also on the Republican side, right? Because the
Thank you.
Republicans never put up anybody credible because my assumption here is they just felt they had no chance, right? So rather than waste money
Yeah.
and resources on a loser mayoral campaign, they just threw in anybody who was willing to carry their banner, and that turned out being Curtis Sliwa, at the time a radio host, right?
Yeah.
That was his job at that point, a radio host. And for
Right.
those that don't know, he still walks around wearing his red beret from the 70s when he was a
Yeah.
guardian
Yeah.
angel and
Yeah.
everything.
It's
He,
not the right look for a Republican candidate.
Especially right, right. So you had that sort of interplay, right? Like Adams probably should have been the Democratic primary winner. He wasn't. Cuomo kind of stepped in, assumed that his name would be enough for people to say Cuomo instead of the socialists. And by the time he came around to the conclusion that, oh crap, I can lose this thing, it was way too late. People had
By the
voted.
time he realized he could lose, he was gonna lose.
He was already gone. And
Yeah.
to the extent that he never went out and shook hands, he never visited the bodegas, he never went into the delis, he never went to Wall Street. None of that. It was just like, I'm Andrew Cuomo,
All
vote
of
for
which
me.
is important in any local election,
Right.
but no less so in New York than any place else on this planet, right? New
Yeah.
Yorkers, like, we always make fun of the presidential primaries in, for example, Iowa, where, the old saying is, how do you feel about presidential candidate X, Y, or Z? And the Iowan says, I don't know, I've only met him 3 times.
Right.
They
Right.
expect to see you and to shake your hand and to speak with you and to feel your commitment. If nothing else, even if you're a dingaling, you got to show commitment. And Cuomo is a flawed candidate for a variety of background reasons, not the
Right.
least of which is all of the bad behavior during the COVID crises,
Right.
right? So this is not a guy whose name would have just automatically, right,
Right.
cinched the deal.
Yeah.
So I think that was a bad misread from the beginning. I think we also got to say, John, we've got to give Mamdani his due. As much
Yes.
as you and I recognize that socialism is awful, his political philosophy is awful, his understanding of fundamental fill in the blank economics, accounting, really horrible stuff. Really horrible stuff. You got to hand it to him as a campaigner. He's really good at this.
Yeah, it was very much reminiscent of AOC, right?
Yeah.
When Ocasio-Cortez first ran for her House seat, she was literally in the bars talking to Gen Z, talking to millennials. She was in where they were, in the delis, in the fast food areas, in the nightclub, And at first, people are saying like, "What kind of campaign is this? Look at her. She's in the bodega. She's in the bar. She's there." Yeah, but guess what? Bartender, waitress. She connected with the working class much in the way Trump connected with
Yep.
the suburban working class or the rural working class.
Right, and
So
in Trump's case, it was all electronic, but he speaks the language, he comes across as being down to earth and caring and understanding and being of the people of the working class in the United States, and I agree with you, I think there is a lot of stylistic overlap between Mamdani and AOC's campaign. If there is if there is any important difference, I think you've got to hand it to Mamdani. There's an extra 25 IQ points there. I'll say it. I said what I said. He's very articulate. He's a very smart guy. And I think he's a true believer.
mm,
I think he really believes in socialism. He probably believes in a real Marxist brand of communism. And I don't know if I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I don't know that AOC, how do I put this acceptably without intentionally picking an unnecessary fight? I don't know if AOC can be credited with a sufficiently deep appreciation for economic philosophy to, you know, render a stirring support of socialism.
oh no, I think we've all agreed that. Like she just mouths stuff and follows Bernie around. We
Yeah.
get it. We get it.
If you wanted a college professor to teach 19-year-olds about socialism, you don't need a PhD. You need someone with the charisma of Zoran Mamdani.
yeah, I agree with you. And to the extent that we said a lot of this was based on the economy, right? Like a lot of this was despite what the Secretary of the Treasury Bessent has to say, and we saw a lot of his propaganda on X and other
Yep.
outlets today. Um, Inflation is going up. The cost of living is going up. Small businesses are being hurt by the president's economic policies.
Yep.
New Yorkers feel it. Like,
Yep.
New Yorkers don't care that the price of eggs is down from an artificial high due to an avian outbreak, right? They care that their
Right.
milk costs more.
Right.
That's been kind of established. However, how much is this also a referendum on the immigration policies, on ICE showing up, the threats of ICE and of National Guards doing policing? We talked about it earlier, Mike. You said a big mistake you thought strategically was that Trump didn't enact these policies in red cities that were having trouble. He went
Yep.
straight to blue cities and blue states. New
Yep.
Yorkers, for the most part, and Mamdani famously was involved in that shouting match at City Hall
Yep.
when ICE showed up and all that.
Yep.
How much do you feel the immigration policies were reflected in this vote? I'm not saying it was the sole reason or perhaps even the major reason, but how much do you think there's an underlying current of, hey, we don't want ICE in our city. We don't want the National Guard policing our city.
I think it's not a huge issue on its own, but it helped Zoran build street cred. It made a lot of folks feel that he was one of us, right? He was one of them, one of us, one of the people, that he gets it. He was willing to walk the walk. He was willing to be out there. He was out there when the Republican wasn't. He was
Right,
out there when Cuomo wasn't. He was out there when Eric Adams wasn't. So
right.
that when he starts talking about economics, you've got a running start. You know, the old saying, we don't care what you know about until we know what you care about.
Right.
It's not a matter of him caring about immigration per se. He was
Right.
able to demonstrate that he cared about working class people in New York. And so with that as background, his credibility to then pivot and talk about the economy, which was the big issue, all of a sudden he had a huge running start. The other thing that should be said is that if anyone thought that a Republican or a middle of the road Democrat was going to get any traction by having a more right wing outlook
Right.
on immigration, that ship has sailed. I think that Republicans are a victim of their own success here to a certain extent. The big issue during the Biden administration for Republicans was not how mean can you be to people who live here illegally. The issue was, can you close the border,
Right.
or at the very least get control over the border, right? That was the issue. The issue wasn't, can you put together unmarked goon squads and run them through our streets and,
Right.
racially profile people until you hit your quota,
Right.
right? That was not what people were. It's just not. It's not what people were looking for. So the administration has been able to get some control over the southern border with Mexico. That means it's not as big an issue as it used to be. So, for every voter who's like you or me, who is concerned about the constitutionality of how ICE, right, goes about its business, that's an important debate. I'm not going to back down from that being important. It is important how people do business. As a former cop, I continue to believe in the Fourth Amendment, and how law enforcement operates
Right.
is extremely important to the relationship between the electorate, between citizens and our government at every level. That's extremely important. But for every one of us who feels that way, there's 13 more who care a lot more about the economy.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
you take the border out of the equation, what do you got left? You got the economy, and when it comes to the economy, most voters have not studied economics. They know it stinks for them. They're looking for someone who gets it, who's on their side. And so if you're out there, whether it's fighting ICE or fighting inflation, you're fighting for us.
Right. Right. Yep. I get it. And before we move on, let me see if I could share this because I thought this was great being a native New Yorker, Mike. I don't know if you could see it, but that's
Yes.
the cover of the New York Post today.
I thought it was amazing.
On your marks, get set, Zoe, Socialist Mamdani wins the race for mayor. I thought this was great. The red apple. I think all that is
Very
great.
creative.
Very creative on the New York Post. And of course, again, a true New Yorker paper, the New York Post, conservative by nature,
Yep.
but of course, famous for its front page covers. This one is in the top three, Mike, right up there with Headless Body Found in Topless Bar. That's probably the most famous one they ever had. And the other one was a dramatic fire kills 50 in apartment building, but cat survives. Those are some of the top ones you get from the Post.
My personal favorite was when Trump was going through his first divorce and it was getting contentious, and the Post ran in giant block letters, Ivana better deal.
There you go. So, give the New York Post credit. Great cover, great use of play on words there. Everything great. All right. So, moving on from the New York City mayor's race, which we talked about. So, we're chalking it up to youthful energy and the economy is, I think, and botched politics, and perhaps in the way that Trump was elected, the perfect storm. Weird
The perfect
candidates.
storm. The other thing is, you had said we were going to talk about the general and then work back to the
Yeah.
primary. Shame on the Democratic Party for not having its ducks in a row.
Yep.
It's a sign, in my view, in the long run, we will look back on this as a signal that the Democratic Party was weak, and its weakness is what produced a socialist as their candidate. I do not believe that we will look back on this a decade or two from now and say, good for the Democratic Party. They did themselves a lot of good. They did New Yorkers a lot of good, or they did America a lot of good. I don't think that's going to be the legacy.
I agree, and again, having been through a couple of these cycles, I view this as another De Blasio administration. De Blasio, for those that don't know, was actually allegedly an arms runner for the Sandinistas. So he managed to get himself
And it's
elected.
all over CNN these days, by the way.
Right. Nobody cares.
You can recover from these things.
Right. You can. All right. So moving on. And also I'll throw in bad on the Democrats, bad on the Republicans for not having even a competent candidate ready to go for this event. They should have seen this coming. They could have put up a
This was
better
an
fight.
election that Rudy Giuliani won, I get it,
Yeah.
8 years ago or something, a long time ago, but not 128 years ago,
Right.
right?
And after him, Bloomberg won running as a Republican initially, before he switched to
A
being an independent.
Republican-ish, right?
Republicanish, much like Trump, a Republicanish person, a Republican New Yorker
A
is
New York
probably.
Republican. We don't even know what that means.
Yeah, I see. I would have said Rockefeller Republican, but I don't want you to scold me for being my references being 1,000-year-old, Mike.
We all love ourselves some Rocky Nelson Rockefeller.
There you go. All right, let's move on. The next big race, working our way down the Eastern Seaboard, was in New Jersey, where Mickey, oh, let me look at her name, Mickey Sherrill,
Yep,
the Democrat,
yep.
defeated Jack.
Blue helicopters for the Navy.
Right, so a veteran defeated Jack Ciattarelli in
Yep,
New Jersey. Now, again, New Jersey tends to be a blue state, occasionally flips red.
yep.
Uh, and in this case, Mickey Sherrill won, despite, and here's what's interesting, uh, watching the commercials on TV here as in the Jason, New York, a lot of the attack ads against Sherrill were that she supported tax increases, trying to paint her as someone who supported,
Yep.
more taxes. Apparently that didn't work, Mike. Tell me what happened in New Jersey.
Yeah. People in New Jersey are upset that they're paying so much in taxes. And John, this is, I want to remind you and all of our audience, in the Libertarian Party, we used to have a saying that taxes are theft.
Theft, yes, sir.
Yep. Now, the reason we say taxes are theft is that taxes are theft.
Right.
Okay. And people don't like to pay taxes, not only because they don't like to be out of money,
They don't like
but
to be robbed. Yeah.
they don't like to be robbed. It turns out, who knew? It turns out people don't like to be robbed, and they don't like the way the government spends their money.
Right.
Too often, the government just gives it to someone else, which is, if you were to take a 30,000 view foot of this, that's a weird thing. And the money that the government spends on actually doing things, so often the government doesn't do a very good job of it. So
Right.
people resent property taxes going through the roof, income taxes too high, inflation is rampant. People are afraid of the economy making the turn toward AI and the government not being able to do much about it. And of course, at the federal level, we have lots of tariffs going up and down on the rest of the world's exports to the United States every day, not only contributing to the cost of living, which is a problem, but importantly, a la our previous discussion of I don't care what you know about till I know what you care about, Republicans look like they don't care as much about the cost of living when they support all these tariffs. It's not a math problem, right? Maybe, by the way, we don't even have the data to do the math. But if we had all the data we needed to do the math and we were to come to the conclusion, gee, tariffs only add this, little tiny smidge to the cost of living, I'm not sure that argument would carry a lot of water because people want to see you fighting to get the cost of living down. And that means lowering taxes, including tariffs, and it means going to bat for better jobs and jobs that are going to pay well and survive into the future. And Cheryl was able to portray herself as being in touch with these issues, suggested that President Trump was out of touch with these issues, and was able to hang that around Ciattarelli's neck.
Which is sort of a juxtaposition, right? Because typically you would expect the Republican to be
Yep.
able to put across those ideals. Like again, and maybe now's the time to talk about this. How much of our traditional views of how the duopoly operates, to the extent that there is a difference between them, how do words mean anything anymore, Mike? Because you would think this was a Republican issue. If you're worried about high cost of living, if you're worried
Yep.
about taxes, especially in a state like New Jersey or even New York, you would turn around and say, let's bring a Republican back in, because despite everything else, the one thing Republicans should know how to do is manage money. And apparently, I mean, look, libertarians have known this for a while, but why did this fail and this messaging fail?
Yeah. First of all, words don't have much meaning anymore. Stories don't have history doesn't have much meaning. Reality is
Mm.
losing ground. You know,
Right,
if
right.
reality were on the ballot, it would have come in third place.
Mm.
This whole idea that President Reagan loved tariffs is something that someone just decided to say, someone who
Complete
didn't
complete
care whether it
lies.
was true or not.
Complete
Pardon?
lies. Complete lies. Yeah.
Complete lies, not anchored to anything based in reality. You know, people just say things in a world in which words and stories and history and reality don't mean much anymore. Branding means even less. So the labels that politicians attach to themselves and attach to each other don't have as much meaning as they used to. So the idea of what those brands mean sliding all over the place, I think that you can expect more of that in the future. And it
Mm.
makes it easier to come true what libertarians have said about the Republican and Democratic Party for a long time, that they are in some sense merging together. Neither party has done a very good job of standing up for fiscal conservatism or free markets or adherence to the Constitution or medical freedom
Right.
or less militaristic intervention. Yeah, I would argue that the Trump administration has done a much better deal with avoiding foreign conflicts than some many previous administrations. That's terrific. But to your point, I just think that people no longer believe. But by the way, I think people are right to not any longer believe that the Republican Party is doing a great job for them when it comes to these very basic economic principles.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because even in the course of this election, you saw a lot of it. Now, Mike, when we prep for this show, it was very interesting how you and I both view what's happening in the world, right? To some extent, when we talked about a particular issue, you'd say to me, like, John, I'm just not hearing any buzz around this. And when you say sometimes, like, I've heard this, this, and this, and I'll be like, I'm not seeing any of this, right?
You're
And,
right.
and that, despite us being of a similar age, I spend most of my life on X and
Yep.
Facebook, all the internet stuff. You're like, I'm glued to the TV like 24 hours a day watching news feeds and things like that, right? For the most part, I'm saying. And it
I
was
spend a
interesting.
lot of time. Yeah, I'll tell you. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what I do because I think that I want youngsters to have a little bit of this going on. I go back and forth on basically four channels, right? I do the Vox podcast on the left, right?
Right,
I do Ben Shapiro's stuff on the right. I do Fox News on the right, and I do CNN on the left.
right. You're
And
trying
I
to get that 360 media
and you still
consumption, right?
don't.
Right, right.
You still don't, right?
Yeah.
But I think you gotta try.
Oh,
It's
oh,
not
sure, sure, sure. And
yeah.
what's interesting is, like, so it's funny that when you go through your sort of um, process for consuming news and events, and I go through mine, which is again essentially almost 100% online at this point in my life. Like, it's interesting how you see that division, right? Because I started telling you about stuff like, hey, they're already claiming that there's fraud in New York City, and there's that
I
there's that whole trend of, the ballot that Elon Musk put up, right? And he helped it go viral, which was, look, they're rigging the election. Mamdani's name is on 4 times. Cuomo's name isn't until the last option on the ballot. And I can't tell you how many tweets and replies I did by saying that's normal in New York City. More than one party can nominate the same person. So in
Of
the case of
course.
so the case of Mamdani was the Democrats nominate him, the Socialists nominate him, the Working Party, the Working Families Party, whichever
It's
one it was.
okay not to like that.
Absolutely, but it's not a rigged election because of that.
Not fraud.
Right, it's not fraud. Then in the New Jersey case, there was all these weird things about, they're preventing people from voting. You had Carolyn Levitt come out and say the president is preparing an executive order to address the illegality and the stolen elections and this and that. Mike, is this a playbook that it's obvious it's being run back again by the Trump administration? Do you feel that once again this will have any sort of resonance with people? Or to your earlier point, and this is the reason I brought it up, is this just words along the lines of President Reagan loved tariffs? Is it the same type of thing? Or do you feel
It
there
is the
may
same type of thing, and I worry that it's both.
Mm,
And
yes,
can it
I see
be
what you're
both
saying.
silliness and get traction? Yes. Silliness does get traction sometimes. There is no evidence that there was a significant amount of fraud in any of the elections that took place yesterday. That's not to suggest that we can't better perfect some of our processes, right?
Right.
And it's not to suggest that you don't occasionally have some ballots that go unread, misread, miscalculated. I get all that. It's not a perfect world, but there's a big difference between it's not a perfect world and we need some politician to start screaming about fraud.
Right,
You
right,
know,
right.
what on one end is 99%, on the other end is 1%. We need to settle the hell down and get anchored back to reality, or else we're in a world of trouble.
I agree. I agree, Mike. And I'm glad to see that you and I are of a similar mind on that issue. All right, let's for the
Having
sake
said that, I did vote several hundred times yesterday.
yeah.
I was all about it.
Uh,
Now that I've been back in the Republican Party now this year, having been in the Republican Party for, many, many, many years before working in the Libertarian Party, I do want to be supportive of my Republican cohort. So I was in there. We vote in a church around the corner from my house, and
mm.
I spent all day there. Nancy was bringing me coffee and donuts, and I just voted. I just kept voting over and over again.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry but you just put this thought in my head. Have you ever seen the movie The Gangs of New York with
Yes,
Richard Daniel Lewis?
Day
Daniel Day
Lewis.
Lewis. The one voting scene was fantastic, and this was in the context of Tammany Hall, where back then they would tell you could go vote again, just shave your beard. Okay, now
Right,
go get a haircut, vote again,
right.
because that's how they ID people. And
Yeah,
what was Tammany Hall's reaction? The aide said, "We've run out of ballots," and he goes, "Well, print up more ballots. It's not how many votes you get; it's he who counts the votes." And that open corruption, that open use of the system, right?
that's
And I
exactly it. We have not had that in the United States for many, many decades. We all remember, well, the youngsters might not remember. This might be worth reminding the young people in our audience that were it not for Mayor Daley in Chicago,
yes,
not the most recent Mayor Daley of a couple of decades ago, but several decades ago, his father, the old man, Richard J. Sr., were it not for the fact that he threw dozens and dozens and dozens of machines into Lake Michigan from Republican heavy districts, Cook County, Illinois would have been, much more Republican, potentially carrying all of Illinois and potentially putting Richard Nixon in the White House in 1960
instead of Kennedy.
instead of John F. Kennedy. A lot of folks thought that was just um, conspiracy theory kind of stuff. It couldn't possibly be true. But indeed, many of those machines were found a couple of decades ago.
Yeah.
They were not found in a condition in which you would know, the paper ballots were all destroyed, of course, by, a few hours of salt water. Those things are gone. Um, it was probably the last time that we really had a significant bout of election fraud in this country.
Right, right. And again, that's not to suggest you can't find cases of fraud, but to start issuing executive orders, God knows why and for what, that's over the top.
Yep.
All right, let's move on. The governor's race in Virginia.
Yep.
Abigail
My
Spanberger,
state, the
your state.
Commonwealth.
Okay, so you got something to say about this.
Oh yeah.
Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, defeated Winsome Earl Sears, a
Yep.
Republican. Spanberger becomes Virginia's first female governor.
Yep.
And Virginia was, correct me if I'm wrong, a red state. This flips it to blue. Is that correct? In
It
terms of
depends on how you
governorship?
look at it. We had a
Yeah.
red governor.
You had a red governor, now you have a blue governor. Talk
Yep.
to me about the Virginia governor's race and what that may potentially mean in the context
First of all, a bit of
election.
trivia. You brought up the trivia of having a female governor, which is, terrific, and not quite the oddity that it would have been, even a generation ago. Of course, is a very strong candidate. But here's an interesting piece of trivia. We had, of course, the usual repeated bouts of advertising on television and
Right.
online over the past several weeks. In the ads for Winsome Earl Sears and in the ads for Abigail Spanberger, both of the dueling sets of ads, right? There were three particular individuals who were commonly featured in all of the ads.
Right.
And this was the case for a good, I would say, 14-day period or so. For a
Okay.
good 14 days, most of the ads for Abigail had three certain people, recognizable people in them. And most of the ads for Winsome had three recognizable particular people in them. Can you name those three people?
I'm gonna guess Trump, Vance, and maybe Hegseth. I don't know.
One was Winsome herself. She was in all of the Abigail ads.
Okay.
The other was Abigail. She was in all of the Winsome ads,
Okay.
plus the candidates themselves. So all I'm asking you to do is name the third individual who appeared in most of these candidates' ads.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'll give you 4 seconds.
Trump.
Me.
You're kidding me.
I am not kidding you.
Okay, now this I got to hear. How did this happen?
Mike Tremont, Abigail Spanberger, and Winsome Sears, Earl Sears, are the three people who were prominently featured in 2 weeks worth of ads for both candidates. And that's because there was an event in, I actually don't remember what town now, but there was an event with a parade, and the Libertarian Party had a parade, and we had my Chevy Silverado, right? And we stood in the back of the truck and we were throwing candy, even though I can't remember which town. This is what we did in all of the parades. So, and we hung signs off the back of the Chevy, libertarians, blah, 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 Oliver, Mike
Right.
Tremont, blah, blah, blah. Okay. At the end of the parade, at a pavilion, there was a rally, and everyone got to speak for a few minutes. Glenn Youngkin spoke for a few minutes. I got to speak for a few minutes, and Winsome got to speak for a few minutes. And we would sit on the stage waiting our turn.
Okay.
Now, if this story is too long, you can edit it out, but I find this fascinating. I leaned over and I introduced myself to Governor Youngkin. And I said, I understand that you went to Rice. I just learned that like within those 30 seconds. And he had gone to Rice. He had played basketball on a scholarship. Very big guy, right? A very athletic guy. And I said to him, why does Rice play Texas? Now, this is a very famous question. The reason it's such a famous question is because just before John Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon, he said, why do people, climb Mount Everest? Why do people cross the oceans? Why does rice play Texas? Now, this always gets edited out of that very famous speech.
Oh,
If you
right.
if you watch the speech on YouTube, typically there's a break after he says, why do we climb Mount Everest and why do we choose to go to the moon? And the edited out piece is why does rice play Texas? And the reason it's edited out is because no one understands the context.
Right.
Rice, huge engineering school. It's in Texas. Texas is where there's going to be a huge investment in the NASA program. And Kennedy loved to tease the people to whom he was speaking. So he's standing in front of a crowd of engineers graduating from Rice. And he says, why does Rice play Texas? And he says, because it's hard.
Right.
That's the whole point. Now, if you went to Rice on an athletic scholarship, you've got to know this story.
Right.
He looks at me and says, I don't know, for the revenue? No, because it's hard, Governor, because it makes a man out of you. It makes a
Right.
woman out of you. It makes a competitor out of you, right? That is
It
the
builds
answer.
character.
It builds character. It's because it's hard. Now, he and I are having this stupid conversation. Winsome is on stage screaming at people who are teasing her on the floor of this pavilion.
Mm.
It's not going well for her at all, which is why the governor and I end up in this stupid conversation.
Right.
Cameras are there from both Abigail's campaign and from Winsome's campaign. And they're running footage of Winsome. The footage of her looking good make it into her ads with me and the governor in the background.
Okay.
But most of the ads only have me, not the governor.
Mm.
And then the clips in which she looks horrible make their way into Abigail's ads, and from a slightly different angle have me in the background.
Mm.
So I've been getting lots of phone calls, as you might imagine. Look, you're in Abigail's ads. Yes, okay, in Winsome's ads. And this is the great lesson, is that Winsome provided enormous amounts of material of very weak performances at one event after another, online, in person, not a strong candidate. She went so far as to running an ad that said she's not what she called a polished politician, right? I understand that. We all appreciate individuals who are not polished politicians. We're looking for people who are down to earth, people to whom the electorate can relate, right? Very important concept. But you don't go on television and online and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars running ads saying, I'm not a polished politician, because what people have heard is, I can't get my act together.
Right.
That's the way it came off. It's okay to say I'm not a career politician. I've served my community in different ways. I've been successful in different endeavors. I'm fighting for you. The point is not I'm not polished, right? The point is not, I can't put a decent outfit together and I wear ugly shoes. That's not
Right.
the point. And so it just fell flat. So the Earl Sears campaign got its clock cleaned. What, 14-point differential? Something
Yep.
like this.
Yep.
I don't think we should read too much into it. It is true that, as in New Jersey, the winning Democratic candidate was able to nationalize this a little bit, right? To play off of Trump.
Right.
So, I get why people want to read a little bit into that, but not a strong candidate representing the Republican Party.
So, in your opinion, this was really a race on a referendum on the character of the candidates.
Abigail is a good candidate. Say what
Right,
you will. Abigail Spanberger is a good candidate. She not my cup of tea.
right, right,
know, I'm not voting for a CIA operative. It
right,
just, that's a bridge too far. But she's articulate. She hit the right notes. She leaned against Trump in ways in which it made sense to do so. And don't forget the economy, stupid. She
right.
really focused on that, and people wanted to hear it.
Okay, that's a good assessment there. All right, let's move on to the next big one because I want to make sure we talk about it, which is California Proposition 50. Now, this had to do with the redistricting uh, uh, or gerrymandering effort that Gavin Newsom said he wanted, and he wanted it as a response to Texas and other Republican states gerrymandering their congressional districts. We've done an episode or two about this. Feel free to go check out Liberty Lens Classics, and you can see what we had to say about that then in greater detail. But Mike, in this election, and Prop 50 passed, again, I think this is one of those things because in some weird way, I think exit polls said, yeah, we need to redistrict. In essence, we were okay with the people said we're okay with gerrymandering, but an overwhelming majority thought it should be done by some nonpartisan a committee as opposed to Gavin Newsom saying, I want 5 extra seats in Congress. Uh, Explain the dichotomy to me. Explain if that's something that's expected. What's going on in California?
I think that you're right. The majority of Americans would like it done in a nonpartisan fashion. But that is in some sense because most Americans are seeking some style of fairness. The Republicans are seen, correctly or incorrectly, the Republicans are seen this year as being the aggressor,
Mhm.
especially because of Texas, which
Right.
you're right, you and I discussed in a previous podcast. And so California's move, the governor's move to do this in California looks like a reaction as opposed to being proactive.
Right.
And in that sense, the Republicans in Texas have given the Californians cover. They were able to vote for this fairly aggressive Democratic move and still feel as though they were being fair, right? This vote doesn't happen were it not for the Republicans. Now, having said that, there are going to be plenty more votes all over the United States, or there will be cases of legislatures taking matters into their own hands. Will this build up enough momentum that finally there will be either a constitutional amendment? Don't hold your breath, that ain't easy. Or a wave of bipartisan nonpartisanship. Has there ever been a wave of bipartisan nonpartisanship? Has there ever been an example where all of a sudden everyone decided to get together and, let's
Uh,
just be nice to each other and play fair?
Honestly, the last one I remember is Tip O'Neill and Reagan agreeing to some sort of bipartisanship. That's the last one in my political
That's right. And that
awareness.
didn't permeate all the way down to state legislators deciding to vote in a way that created some
Correct.
institutionalized way of doing business
That
that
was
would
right.
handcuff both of them.
That was very much on the federal level, and you're right. It was more just a rather than constantly be at a stalemate. It was actually negotiation and
Yeah,
compromise.
let's work something out.
Yeah.
So, to your point, there could be examples where relatively purplish states, uh, their legislators get together and decide to develop some sort of commission to redistrict. There would have to be a set of principles established that can be done. Economists do this all the time with metropolitan statistical area definitions, but there would have to be some sort of agreement on what those principles are. And then, of course, before you vote, you would know what the implications were. This is where the
Right.
real problem is that even if even if a Republican and a Democrat were able to agree, these are the principles that we want to follow. This is the type of procedures, it's the type of procedure that we want to follow in order to redraft the district boundaries. Okay, we agree on all that. What would the implication be? What would happen? Right? Oh, well, it turns out Democrats would lose 2 seats. I'm making up an example. Okay, it's going to be really hard for a Democrat to vote for that.
Right.
Not only because the Democrat would lose the 2 seats, but because it would make it look to his or her constituents that he didn't care about how successful his party was.
Right.
And remember, not only do we not live in a political vacuum in which these people can make these decisions, but the underlying electorate is at least as polarized as their elected officials in many cases. So most politicians just don't have a lot of leeway in terms of voting for something that might be seen as nonpartisan.
And that's why I think I agree with you. We're not going to see a wave of bipartisanship in our lifetimes, I don't think. And the only hope I would have is some sort of cool off period or rules based thing. For example, I would be very much, and I could think you could sell it to a lot of politicians, is gerrymandering can only occur concurrent with the national census, which means once every 10 years. Like,
To at least slow it down.
at least slow it down and give both parties the opportunity to strategize around it, to get votes out around it. Now, because I think what we have now is it's very much a knee jerk reaction, obviously, right? The president wants this. He needs Texas to have more Republicans in Congress. Okay, we could get that done in 6 weeks. You know what I mean? Which is
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
happen. And now in California, it's like, well, we just saw what happened 6 weeks ago. We got to go gerrymander everything, and it's just a never-ending cycle. Because right now, no governor wants to be the first one to appear weak,
Right,
regardless, Democrat or Republican, right?
right.
Whereas if by law somehow they were mandated that the only time we could do this is then as the result of the next uh, census, you know it's only happening every 10 years on the tens, right? 2020, 2030,
Yep,
2040. It slows it down a little bit
yep.
and it allows resistance, if that's the right word,
Yeah,
to propose gerrymandering. Gives time for people to think about it, to perhaps weigh the implications. I like if we got to that point at least, I'd be happy for right now. I would view that as a huge victory, Mike.
I would view that as a small victory. I'll give it to you. That would be a better place, but I think that people are going to go as aggressive as possible, as aggressive as mathematically possible.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
once if you're
from
allowed
now
to take
on.
yeah, if you're allowed to take advantage, you should. Talk to me about the national implications of Prop 50. We're talking maybe 5 extra Democratic seats, in
Yep.
Congress from California.
Which is enough to tighten up the national legislature, right? It's enough to tighten up the House of Representatives in a virtual dead heat, but it gets complicated. We don't know how quickly other states are going to redistrict, and we don't. There are people who know. I'm not one of them. How many seats we're talking about going in both directions? So it's a
Right.
little bit up in the air.
But it
Now
does
there
make things interesting, right?
extremely important.
Right.
Now, there is another issue that I'm dying to talk about, and that is the implication for the elections and the implication of all kinds of other things going
Right.
on for using the federal government shutdown as an excuse to end the Senate filibuster rule in order to allow Republicans to control the Senate with only 50 votes.
Right, and
Because,
just let me give, like, a very
yep,
quick, bit of a background here. As of right now, as I look at
yep,
my, X feed, the president is now saying, "Hey, I had nothing to do with these Democratic wins," right? So that's the first thing he said. Trump wasn't on the ballot, you can't blame
right,
Trump for this. The second thing he said is, "But given what happened, you need to give us the filibuster." You need to give me, in essence, more power. You can't let Democrats hold us up. What kind of country would this be if the person in charge doesn't get all his wishes fulfilled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Right.
Mike, to me, that's just Trump saying, I want to be king. I deserve to be king. That's what a libertarian hears. But Mike, you perhaps are closer to the non-libertarian voices out there. How does the rest of the country hear these types of demands from the president? You mentioned the filibuster. That's a key thing, right?
Yep.
But how we kind of know how that works politically in the Senate, but how does that work with the voters? How do the
Yep.
voters feel about this?
I think that for a lot of Republicans, there is a feeling that if a party has won a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, has won control of the White House, and is not encumbered by law, by the Constitution, is not stopped, right? That it ought to be able to pursue its agenda.
Right.
There is a very strong feeling that that logic is fairly consistent and constitutional. That a lot of folks are making too big a deal out of this idea of checks and balances. There is a very strong feeling that checks and balances are an excuse to be squishy, or an
Okay.
excuse to be rhino, an excuse to be Democrat light, right? There is a feeling that the Democrats have been far too aggressive in pursuing their left wing agenda for a long time, which is true, which
Sure.
is true. And therefore, it's the Republicans' time, and they need to be allowed to be at least as aggressive as the Democrats have been. Again, a sense of fairness. I should put that in air quotes, right? A sense of fairness, that it's a retribution being no longer a bad word,
Right.
right? That turnabout is fair play. And these Senate rules, right now the rule is that for the Senate to pass a piece of legislation, if it's not directly related to the budget, it requires 60 votes out of 100, not 50. And that's a weird thing. It's not in the Constitution. It's a rule that the Senate came up with on its own, effectively in 1917. In 1917, the rule was 66. The rule was 2/3. So 60 is actually lightening a little bit. And before that, this is an odd thing for which I had no appreciation. Effectively, the rule was 100 before 1917, in the sense that one guy, and they were guys, right? One guy could stand on the floor and hold up the whole thing, but you had to stand on the floor.
Right.
We all remember the movie with Jimmy Stewart, right? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But once he sat down, the Senate could get back to business. Well, apparently in 1917, a whole lot of people were upset and decided we need a rule that forced these people to end the debate. So they came up with this rule that said, all right, if we get 66 votes, we can vote anyone down and make them shut up, and then we can have our regular vote. All right, that makes sense. And then that was too unwieldy, so we went to 60 votes. Well, in the meantime, in the early 70s, apparently the Senate came up with this rule that I don't remember. I was only 11 years old, but I don't remember going through this process of coming up with a rule that said the Senate can consider other business while tabling, right, holding up debate on something else. So now, if the Senate can't invoke cloture, can't get those 60 votes, they can just move on with their day and do other business while the bill that you couldn't close the debate on still is open. Some senator says, well, I've got an objection, I want to debate it, and you can't get 60 votes to shut me down, so we just table it, and the Senate just moves on with its business. A very strange situation. not constitutional. It's just a rule that the Senate came up with. Okay, well, now what do you got? You've got the whole country is upset that the government is closed, right? The whole country is upset. Democrats are not going to vote to reopen. The Republicans don't have much incentive to engage with a big debate process with the Democrats to give them something that they want in order to get them to vote to reopen the government. So what are we going to do? Well, Trump's idea, and he's probably right, that people are going to be mad at the Republicans or they're not going to be, irrespective. We might as well change this rule from what used to be 66 and then went to 60, just change it down to 50 and have a simple majority shutdown debate on one issue or another. In this case, reopening the budget and enacting a continuing resolution. Simple majority. Just let's move on with the Senate's business and vote on the continuing resolution. The House has already agreed to it. The president signs it. It goes into law. The government's back open. And I think the president is probably right in this sense that if the Republicans don't do it now, the Democrats are eventually going to do it. Americans are frustrated by the process. And John, how else is this drama going to end? How else are we going to reopen are we going to keep the government closed for years? Rhetorically, I don't know how else to put it.
I'm crossing my fingers that the blessed shutdown continues, Mike, because look, all joking aside, here's the problem, right? That I see, and maybe I'm being too theoretical. One of the problems I see is, and you're right, I've seen a lot of it from Republican influencers and politicians that, hey, we got to do it to the Democrats before they do it to us, right? Like,
Yeah.
so they're at this stage now. Something I found ironic and hilarious was Vance saying this during a TPUSA, I don't know, revival meeting or
Yeah.
whatever those things are. And I said, oh yeah, that's from the part of the Bible where Jesus says, "Screw others before they can screw you." Right? It's like,
Right.
I mean that because it literally that's what Vance was saying in an evangelical tone, right? Like he goes,
Yeah.
even if they haven't done it yet, you know they will. So we might as well slit their throats while we get the chance. So
Yeah.
that type of rhetoric, that type of positioning, Mike, to me is negative, right?
Oh yeah.
To the extent that we can avoid it, we should. And then the second thing is, if we're like on some level, I think you're right. On a very instinctive level, people are like, look, Republicans control everything, better or worse, as long as they're not violating the Constitution and as long as they're not violating rights, they should be able to implement their agenda. The question is, objectively, and I don't know if there is a way to determine this objectively, are they would they be in a position to violate rights and violate the Constitution? Some people might think so, Mike, because we know we have at least 4 or 5 Republican senators who are not on board with getting rid of the filibuster, who are not on board with getting rid of the 60 vote requirement. McConnell, who else is in there? McConnell, Murkowski, I think. Who else is in there?
A whole bunch.
Rand
And
Paul, right? So I mean,
Yep.
so talk to me about those senators. Are they actually rhinos? Do they have some actual principle behind this? Do they just respect Senate tradition? What's going on with those guys and gals?
The Senate has enjoyed this 100 years of requiring a supermajority to move legislation along because it makes every senator a little bit more important.
Sure.
Senators with their 6-year term see themselves as longer term princes who can outlast relatively short term political White House interests, right? They see themselves as a little bit above month to month bickering.
Sure.
They all realize that they're only one election cycle away from being in the minority. And so if they wind up in the minority, they like the idea of having this power of being able to hold up legislation with only 40 votes. And to take that away would make every senator a little bit less important when he or she finds himself or herself in the minority once again. So you've got that played off against pressure from the White House that just wants to get what it wants to get, right?
Right.
I don't know that there is an objective way of looking at it, in the sense that it's hard to predict that the Senate would otherwise provide a constitutional check. I think that the Senate is providing merely a political check, if you know what I mean.
Right.
I don't know that the Senate is all that much more full of constitutionally principled Americans than any other body of politicians these days. Uh, Optimistically, we might hope so. I'm not convinced. I do think that it's a matter of these folks opposing getting rid of this rule because they want to hang on to power themselves, because they don't want Trump's agenda to go forward, because their constituents don't like Trump. In the case of Democrats, they just don't want to get steamrollered, and they don't want to be seen by their constituents as being rolled by this administration, which is probably at least as important as being actually rolled, is being seen to be.
Right.
That's very, very important. Is it true that the time has probably come? The time has probably come at which the Democrats are going to do this anyway. That's probably true, by the way. As
Right.
crass a statement as that is, it probably is true that the Democrats would do it otherwise.
Right. No, I think maybe it's just one of those things that the momentum has started towards it. But there was something romantic about the concept of the Senate being the world's greatest deliberative body. And I don't know if it's that sort of thing that keeps it romanticized in my head, but I would hate to see the filibuster go. I think part of it could be cured if you had third parties in there. You wouldn't need the 60 votes if you had more than two parties in there, right? If you had the
Well, let me
libertarians
ask
in
you
there.
something. Would
Yeah.
would you support? I hear you, by the way. I'm not
Yeah.
arguing with you. Would you support a supermajority requirement in the House of Representatives?
No, and I'll tell you why, because I think part of the design is that House of Representatives are short-termers, right? They're there for 2 they're supposed to represent the immediate interests of the people.
Well, sure, but remember that we're only in this pickle because of Senate rules. This is not in the Constitution.
Oh, no, no, I agree. I'm just going by I'm trying to sort it out in my head, right? The House is for more immediate change, more immediate legislative
But maybe
action.
that argues that we should require a supermajority there. The Senate, at least, they have these people that are statewide uh, winners of elections. They're there for 6 years. Maybe they don't require a rule that says they all have to get together. It's the House that, ebbs and flows so quickly. Maybe they're the body that should have the supermajority.
That's interesting. I never really took it from that perspective. I kind of viewed it as in terms of the way the Constitution gives the elected the length of service or the length of terms, right? You've got Supreme Court judges for life, you've got the Senate for 6 years, you've got presidents for 4 years, and you've got House of Representatives, the representatives for 2 years. To me, that's a pecking order in perhaps the way the founders thought that each one needs to deliberate more because of they're given more tenure and therefore should be above political bickering, right? The Supreme Court should be 100% beyond political bickering. The Senate less so. The president can afford to be a political animal, and the House of Representatives should always be political animals. That's kind of like the Venn diagram I have bouncing around my empty dome, Mike. I don't know if that made sense or not.
I get it. No, it makes sense. I totally understand. I I would like to see a more activist judiciary. Activist is the wrong word. Totally wrong word. I
I was going to
misspoke.
say it has wrong intentions there. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
what
man.
I mean is active. I would
Active,
like to
yeah.
see a judiciary that did a better job of standing up for the Constitution instead of being so deferential now for decades, decade after decade.
Right.
It's just too differential to the administration, to the executive branch, in my view.
Agreed. And you know what? That's a great other episode of Liberty Lens we should have. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week. We had a nice full show on the elections of 2025, and looking forward to discussing more issues of interest to a lot of people interested in liberty. For my co host, Mike Termott, and myself, Big John, we will see you again next week right here on the Distant Warrior channel. Until that point, peace, everyone.